Marcus Whitehorse dropped his radio, the device clattering against granite as his weathered hands trembled. 800 pounds of grizzly bear lay dying on the forest floor, wrapped in the crushing coils of something that shouldn't exist in Yellowstone, a 20-foot Burmese python. The bear's massive head turned toward him, dark eyes meeting his own with impossible recognition. Dr. Sarah Strongbear stumbled backward, her medical kit spilling across pine needles as she gasped. "Dear God, that's not possible." The python's coils tightened with hydraulic precision, each breath stolen from the bear's massive lungs. Marcus felt his chest constrict as memories flooded back. A tiny cub, no bigger than a house cat, mewing in his arms 15 years ago. The same trusting eyes that now pleaded for help from beneath tons of crushing muscle. "Get the tranquilizer gun," he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency he couldn't explain to Sarah. What had brought this nightmare to his mountain? The morning mist clung to Yellowstone's valleys like old grief, and Marcus Whitehorse knew something about both. At 62, his joints ached with each step along the familiar trails, but his eyes remained sharp. 35 years of reading the wilderness had taught him to see what others missed. Today felt different, though. The elk were silent, the birds restless, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Marcus adjusted his radio and continued his patrol near Dunraven Pass, the weight of recent troubles heavy on his shoulders. Emma's medical bills were mounting faster than his ranger's salary could handle, and the doctors said her Alzheimer's would only get worse. Last night, she'd forgotten his name again, calling him "that nice man who brings me coffee." He'd smiled and brought her coffee, swallowing the pain like bitter medicine. 40 miles away, Dr. Sarah Strongbear sat in her empty veterinary clinic, staring at the closure notice that had arrived yesterday. 23 years of saving wildlife, and it all came down to numbers on a government spreadsheet. Budget cuts, they called it. Progress. At 58, she was too old to start over and too stubborn to quit. The silence in her clinic felt deafening. No animals recovering in the back room, no staff bustling about. Just her and the ghosts of all the creatures she'd failed to save. Her daughter Rebecca hadn't called in 6 months. "You care more about animals than people," she'd said during their last argument. Maybe she was right. Animals didn't break promises or leave you sitting alone at graduation ceremonies. They didn't grow up and forget to call. Sarah's hands, once steady enough to perform surgery on a hummingbird's wing, now trembled slightly as she poured her third cup of coffee. The photo on her desk showed her late husband, Tom, arms wrapped around a younger version of herself, both of them grinning beside a rescued black bear cub. Tom had understood her calling. "You're not saving animals," he told her once. "You're saving the part of humanity that still believes in mercy." The radio crackled to life, interrupting her reverie. "All units, we have a report of unusual animal activity near Dunraven Pass. Possible injured wildlife, requesting immediate response." Sarah grabbed her medical kit without thinking. Muscle memory from decades of emergency calls kicked in, pushing aside her personal troubles. Whatever was out there needed help. And despite everything, the closure notice, the loneliness, the arthritis in her fingers, she was still the best wildlife veterinarian within 100 miles. As she drove toward the coordinates, neither she nor Marcus could have imagined that their paths were about to converge around a secret that had been hidden for 15 years, a secret that involved trust, illegal choices, and a bond between species that defied every regulation in the book. In the deep forest, something ancient and powerful was fighting for its life, and the only two people who could save it were carrying wounds of their own that ran deeper than any python's bite. The gravel crunched under Marcus's boots as he approached the coordinates, his truck's engine ticking in the sudden silence. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. There, sprawled across a small clearing like some nightmare from another world, was a sight that violated every natural law of Yellowstone. An enormous grizzly bear, easily 800 pounds of raw power, lay motionless beneath the crushing embrace of a python that belonged in the Florida Everglades, not the Rocky Mountains. The snake was massive, nearly 20 feet of muscle and malice, its thick coils wrapped around the bear's torso like steel cables. Each breath the bear attempted was met with tighter constriction, the python's ancient killing method playing out in Marcus's sacred wilderness. But it was the bear's eyes that stopped Marcus's heart cold, dark, intelligent, and unmistakably familiar. Those eyes had looked up at him from a cardboard box 15 years ago when they belonged to a 6-week-old cub whose mother had been gunned down by poachers. The same eyes that had watched him leave food and water at the forest's edge for months after an illegal release that could have cost him everything. "Thunder," Marcus whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer. The bear's massive head turned at the sound, a soft chuff of recognition barely audible over the python's sinister hissing. Thunder's left ear, marked by a distinctive notch from a childhood encounter with barbed wire, twitched in the way Marcus remembered from those secret months of bottle feeding and sleepless nights. Marcus's radio crackled to life, shattering the terrible intimacy of the moment. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. Dr. Strongbear is en route to your location, ETA 5 minutes. Panic flooded Marcus's system. Sarah couldn't see this, couldn't see the recognition between him and Thunder. Too many questions would follow, questions that would unravel 15 years of carefully guarded secrets, questions that would expose the illegal wildlife possession, the unreported rescue, the federal regulations he'd violated out of love for an orphaned cub. But Thunder was dying. The python's coils had tightened with mechanical precision, and Marcus could see the bear's breathing becoming more labored, more desperate. Minutes mattered now, maybe seconds. The python's head swiveled toward Marcus, tongue flicking to taste his scent, calculating whether this new threat was worth releasing its prize. The creature was magnificent in its horror, scales gleaming like black armor, muscles rippling with enough power to crush a man's ribs like dry kindling. This wasn't some escaped pet. This was a killing machine, trained and purposeful in its destruction. Marcus reached for the emergency tranquilizer gun in his truck, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the impossible choice before him. Save Thunder and risk exposing their illegal history, or let his secret son die to protect a career that was already hanging by threads. Thunder's eyes found his again, and in them Marcus saw not just recognition, but trust, the kind of absolute faith that transcends species and defies explanation. The same trust he'd seen when he'd first bottle-fed the tiny cub, when he'd taught him to fish in the remote streams, when he'd made the hardest decision of his life and released Thunder back into the wild. The sound of Dr. Strongbear's vehicle approaching forced Marcus into action. He grabbed the tranquilizer gun and approached the deadly tableau, his mind racing through 15 years of carefully constructed lies that were about to crumble. Sarah's truck skidded to a halt, dust billowing around the scene like stage smoke. She emerged with her medical kit, took one look at the impossible sight before her, and froze. Her weathered face went pale beneath her Cherokee features. "Sweet Mother of God," she breathed. "Is that a Burmese python?" Marcus nodded grimly, raising the tranquilizer gun. "Never seen anything like it up here. Must have escaped from somewhere." But even as he spoke, something nagged at him. The python's behavior wasn't random or panicked like an escaped animal. It was deliberate, methodical. And how had it found Thunder, specifically, in thousands of square miles of wilderness? Sarah's professional instincts kicked in, overriding her shock. She pulled on latex gloves and approached cautiously, her experienced eyes assessing the situation. "The bear's going into respiratory distress. We need to act fast." Marcus aimed the tranquilizer gun at the python's head, but the angle was wrong. Too much risk of hitting Thunder. The python seemed to sense the threat, its coils tightening incrementally. Thunder's breathing became even more labored, a soft wheeze escaping his massive lungs. "Wait," Sarah said, studying the scene with clinical precision. "I need to understand the constriction pattern first. If we tranquilize wrong, the python might crush him before it goes unconscious." As she examined the deadly embrace, her trained eye caught something that made her frown. "Marcus, this bear has old surgical scars. Professional work. This animal has been in captivity." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. Sarah's expertise was going to unravel everything, scar by scar. The surgical site where Thunder had been neutered, the healed wound from removing a piece of glass from his paw, evidence of human care that no truly wild bear should carry. "Could be from Fish and Wildlife," Marcus said carefully. "Sometimes they do medical procedures on problem bears." But Sarah was already shaking her head, her fingers tracing the surgical sites through Thunder's fur. "No, this is veterinary work, recent work, within the last few years." Her eyes met Marcus's, sharp with suspicion and growing understanding. "You know this bear, don't you?" Before Marcus could answer, Thunder did something that sent chills down both their spines. Despite his desperate condition, despite the python crushing the life from his lungs, Thunder lifted his massive head and made a soft sound, not a growl or a roar, but the gentle chuff that adult bears make to their cubs. The same sound Marcus had heard every morning for 8 months when Thunder was small enough to sleep curled against his chest. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition of the impossible. "He's trying to communicate with you." "This is deliberate behavior, not fear or aggression." She looked from Thunder to Marcus, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "How long have you known this bear?" The python, as if sensing the human's divided attention, began to shift its coils, preparing for one final crushing embrace. Thunder's eyes rolled back, his breathing shallow and erratic. Time was running out, and Marcus faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Admit to 15 years of illegal wildlife possession, or watch his secret son die while protecting a lie. Thunder's eyes found his one last time, full of trust and forgiveness for whatever choice Marcus made. The tranquilizer gun felt impossibly heavy in Marcus's weathered hands. Marcus pulled the trigger. The tranquilizer dart hit the python just behind its massive head, and for a terrifying moment the snake's coils tightened even further. Thunder's eyes bulged, a desperate wheeze escaping his throat as 800 pounds of muscle and bone were compressed beyond endurance. Sarah lunged forward with her medical kit, her hands working with practiced efficiency even as her mind reeled from the implications of what she was witnessing. "Talk to him," she commanded Marcus, her voice sharp with professional authority. "If this bear knows you, use that connection. Keep him calm while the tranquilizer takes effect." Marcus dropped to his knees beside Thunder's massive head, his weathered hands trembling as they touched the familiar fur. "Easy, boy," he whispered, using the same gentle tone he'd used 15 years ago when Thunder was small enough to hold. "I'm here. You're going to be okay." Thunder's breathing steadied slightly at the sound of Marcus's voice, but the python was fighting the sedative with prehistoric determination. Sarah watched in amazement as the bear's behavior shifted from wild panic to something she'd never seen in her 23 years of veterinary practice: deliberate cooperation. Thunder positioned his body to give Sarah better access to the python's grip points, angling his massive frame despite his agony to help the humans help him. It was impossible, unnatural, and absolutely undeniable. "This bear has been trained," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Professional training. Someone taught him to trust humans, to work with them." She looked at Marcus with growing comprehension. Someone who spent months, maybe years, building this kind of bond. The python's grip began to loosen as the tranquilizer took hold, but the damage was already severe. Sarah immediately began checking Thunder's vital signs, her expert hands finding weak pulse points and shallow breathing. He's got internal injuries, possibly cracked ribs, definitely soft tissue damage. We need to get him to the clinic immediately. As they worked to free Thunder from the python's loosening coils, Sarah discovered something that sent ice through her veins. A small puncture wound on the python's neck, partially healed but clearly visible. "Marcus," she said slowly, "this snake has a tracking chip scar. Someone's been monitoring this animal." The implications hit them both simultaneously. This wasn't an escaped pet or a random encounter. Someone had deliberately released a 20-foot killing machine in Yellowstone, and somehow it had found Thunder specifically among thousands of square miles of wilderness. "We need to call this in," Sarah said, but Marcus grabbed her wrist. "Wait." His voice carried a desperation that surprised them both. "There's something you need to know first, something that could change everything." Before he could continue, Thunder struggled to his feet with painful determination. Despite his injuries, despite nearly dying moments before, the massive bear moved toward Marcus with purpose. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. Thunder gently pressed his enormous head against Marcus's chest, exactly the way a child might seek comfort from a parent. The gesture was so profoundly human, so filled with trust and affection that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "My God," she breathed. "You raised him." Marcus's composure finally cracked. 15 years of carrying this secret, of watching Thunder from a distance, of loving an animal he could never publicly acknowledge, it all poured out in a broken whisper. His mother was killed by poachers when he was 6 weeks old. "I found him dying of starvation, barely bigger than a house cat." Marcus's voice shook as Thunder nuzzled against him. "I couldn't leave him to die. I couldn't send him to a zoo to live in a cage, so I—" "You raised him illegally and released him back into the wild," Sarah finished, understanding flooding her features. "That's why he trusts humans. That's why he recognizes your voice, your scent. You're his father." The weight of the revelation settled between them like a living thing. Marcus had violated federal wildlife protection laws, risked his career and freedom, all for love of an orphaned cub. And now, 15 years later, someone had tried to murder that cub with a weaponized python. "Who knows about Thunder?" Sarah asked, her mind already working through the dangerous implications. "Nobody," Marcus said quickly. "I've been careful, monitored his territory from a distance, made sure he stayed wild." Emma knew, but with her condition. His voice trailed off as the full scope of their situation became clear. Sarah examined the tranquilized python more carefully, her veterinary training focusing on details others might miss. The snake was well fed, recently cared for, and bore the subtle marks of professional handling. This wasn't just any python. This was a trained killer. "Marcus, someone knew about your connection to Thunder. This was targeted." She looked up from the unconscious snake, her face grim. "Someone used your history with him as a weapon. They knew exactly where to find him, knew he would be vulnerable because he trusts humans." Thunder swayed on his feet, the trauma and internal injuries taking their toll. Sarah made a quick decision that would either save his life or destroy both their careers. "We're taking him to my clinic. Unofficial treatment, no paperwork, no reports until we understand what we're dealing with." "Sarah, you could lose your license." "The clinic is already being shut down." "Then we have nothing left to lose," she said firmly. "This bear saved your sanity 15 years ago when you found him. Now it's our turn to save his life." As they prepared to transport Thunder, Sarah's radio crackled with an incoming call. "Dr. Strongbear, this is Ranger Station. We've had a report of unusual python activity in the Dunraven Pass area. Fish and Wildlife wants an immediate status report. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. Someone was monitoring their communications, someone who knew exactly what they would find at those coordinates. "This is Strong Bear," Sarah responded carefully. "Situation contained. Large python tranquilized and secured. No human injuries." "Copy that. Fish and Wildlife is dispatching a team to collect the specimen. ETA 40 minutes. 40 minutes to get Thunder to safety before federal agents arrived with questions they couldn't answer." Sarah looked at the massive bear, now leaning heavily against Marcus for support, and made a decision that would define the rest of her career. "Marcus, I need you to trust me the same way Thunder trusts you. We're going to save him, but it means we're both going to be criminals by the end of the day." Thunder lifted his head and looked between them, as if understanding the sacrifice they were making. In his dark eyes, Marcus saw the same trust he'd seen 15 years ago, when he'd made his first illegal choice to save a dying cub. "He's family," Marcus said simply. "Family is worth breaking the law for." As they loaded Thunder into Sarah's specially equipped veterinary transport, neither of them noticed the small drone hovering in the tree line, its camera recording every moment of their rescue operation. Somewhere, in a place they couldn't imagine, someone was watching their every move and preparing the next phase of a revenge 15 years in the making. The python stirred slightly as they drove away, its predatory eyes opening just enough to fix on the departing vehicle. Even unconscious, it seemed to be calculating, waiting, preparing for another opportunity to complete its deadly mission. Thunder's labored breathing filled the transport vehicle as they raced toward Sarah's clinic, unaware that they were driving straight into a trap that had been 15 years in the making. The veterinary clinic felt like a sanctuary as Sarah backed the transport vehicle up to the rear entrance, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Thunder lay sedated but stable in the mobile unit, his massive chest rising and falling with labored breaths that spoke of internal damage Sarah hadn't yet fully assessed. "Help me get him onto the hydraulic table," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Moving an 800-pound unconscious grizzly bear required equipment designed for large animals, and even then, it was dangerous work. As they maneuvered Thunder onto the examination table, Sarah's experienced hands began a systematic assessment of his injuries. What she found made her stomach clench with professional concern and personal rage. "Marcus, these aren't just crushing injuries from the python," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Look at these marks along his ribs. These are pressure points, like the snake knew exactly where to apply maximum damage with minimum effort." Marcus leaned closer, his weathered face growing pale as he examined the methodical pattern of bruising along Thunder's torso. "You're saying someone trained that python to kill bears specifically?" "I'm saying someone trained that python to kill Thunder specifically." Sarah's hands continued their examination, finding more evidence of the deliberate nature of the attack. The constriction pattern targeted his respiratory system with surgical precision. This wasn't a random predator attack. This was an assassination attempt. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Someone knew about Thunder's illegal history, knew about their bond, and had weaponized that knowledge to destroy them both. But who could have discovered a secret he'd guarded for 15 years? Sarah began preparing emergency treatment protocols, her movements efficient despite the emotional turmoil brewing beneath her professional exterior. As she worked, memories surfaced, fragments of conversations, bureaucratic meetings, faces that had shown too much interest in wildlife patterns around Dunraven Pass. "Marcus," she said slowly, "how many people have access to your patrol reports from the last 15 years? Just the ranger station, Fish and Wildlife, and—" Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his face draining of color. Victor Crow Feather. He was my partner for 12 years before he was terminated. He knew every trail I patrolled, every animal I monitored. Sarah's hands stilled over Thunder's unconscious form. Victor Crow Feather was fired for what? Taking bribes from poachers, selling information about wildlife locations to hunting guides. Marcus's voice grew heavy with the weight of old betrayals. I was the one who reported him. He swore he'd make me pay for destroying his career. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Victor had means, motive, and 15 years to plan his revenge. More importantly, he had access to Marcus's patrol patterns and could have easily noticed the subtle signs of Thunder's presence in areas where Marcus spent extra time. Thunder stirred on the examination table, his massive head lifting slightly as consciousness returned. Despite his pain, his first instinct was to locate Marcus, those dark eyes seeking the familiar face that had meant safety since his cubhood. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, moving to Thunder's side. "We're going to figure this out." Sarah continued her examination, discovering more disturbing evidence. "Marcus, Thunder has old needle marks. Someone's been tranquilizing him regularly." Her voice carried a growing sense of urgency. "This isn't the first time someone's captured him." The revelation sent ice through Marcus's veins. While he'd been watching Thunder from a respectful distance, believing his secret son was living safely in the wild, someone else had been using Thunder as an unwilling participant in a larger scheme. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously, putting it on speaker so Marcus could hear. "Dr. Strongbear," a familiar voice said, one that made Marcus's blood run cold. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Victor Crow Feather's voice carried the same arrogant confidence it had 15 years ago, before his termination and disgrace. Sarah looked at Marcus, who nodded grimly. This was their enemy, revealing himself. "The bear doesn't belong to anyone," Sarah replied carefully. Victor's laugh was cold and calculating. "That's where you're wrong, Doctor. That bear is the product of illegal wildlife possession, federal regulation violations, and criminal conspiracy. When the authorities learn about Marcus's little secret, both of you will be facing serious federal charges." "What do you want?" Marcus said, stepping closer to the phone. "Justice," Victor replied, his voice hardening. "You destroyed my career, my reputation, my life. You sat in judgment of me while you were breaking the same laws, just more cleverly. That bear is the evidence that will finally expose you for the hypocrite you are." Sarah's mind raced through their options. Victor clearly had documentation of Thunder's illegal history, probably surveillance footage, and enough evidence to destroy both their careers. But there was something else in his voice, a satisfaction that suggested his revenge involved more than just legal consequences. "The python wasn't meant to kill Thunder immediately," Sarah realized aloud. "You wanted him injured, vulnerable, so you could capture him and use him as evidence against Marcus." "Very good, Doctor." "Thunder's survival was always part of the plan. A dead bear tells no stories, but a living one with documented human dependency, that's evidence that will stand up in federal court." Thunder's breathing became more labored as stress from the conversation affected his recovery. Sarah made quick adjustments to his IV, her veterinary instincts prioritizing his immediate needs over the psychological warfare Victor was waging. "You've been monitoring him for years," Marcus said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Using him for illegal fighting rings, training your pythons on him." "Training, yes, but not just pythons." Victor's voice carried a disturbing pride. "You'd be amazed what wealthy people will pay to watch exotic animals fight. Your precious Thunder has been quite the profitable investment." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thunder hadn't just been living wild for 15 years. He'd been repeatedly captured, traumatized, forced to fight for the entertainment of people with twisted appetites and deep pockets. She examined Thunder more carefully, looking for signs of the systematic abuse Victor was describing. What she found made her hands shake with rage. Scar patterns consistent with animal fighting, evidence of repeated tranquilization, and behavioral indicators of chronic stress and trauma. "You monster," she whispered. "You've been torturing him." "I've been using him to generate the funds necessary for my real goal, destroying Marcus Whitehorse's life the same way he destroyed mine." Victor's voice carried no remorse, only cold satisfaction. Tonight's python attack was meant to be the grand finale. Thunder dies, Marcus gets charged with illegal wildlife possession, and I release 15 years of surveillance footage showing their illegal relationship. Marcus felt something break inside his chest. All these years, he'd believed Thunder was living free and wild, when in reality, his secret son had been suffering because of choices Marcus had made decades ago. "Where are you, Victor?" Marcus demanded. "Closer than you think. And I'm not alone." The line went dead, leaving them in terrible silence. Sarah immediately began preparing Thunder for transport. "We need to move him now. Your clinic isn't safe, and he needs more advanced medical care than I can provide here." But even as she spoke, they heard the sound of multiple vehicles approaching the clinic. Through the window, Marcus could see federal fish and wildlife vehicles surrounding the building, along with local law enforcement and what appeared to be a specialized exotic animal recovery team. "They're here," Marcus said, his voice heavy with defeat. Sarah looked at Thunder, then at Marcus, and made a decision that would define the rest of her career. "Marcus, there's something I need to tell you about that python attack, something I discovered during my examination but didn't want to say over the radio." She pulled out her phone and showed him a series of photographs she'd taken of the python's body. "Look at these injection sites. This snake was systematically weakened before the attack. The tranquilizer doses, the timing, someone wanted us to save Thunder." Marcus stared at the evidence, trying to process the implications. "You're saying Victor wanted Thunder to survive?" "I'm saying someone else is involved in this. Someone who wanted to expose Victor's operation." Sarah's voice carried a growing excitement. "Marcus, what if tonight wasn't Victor's grand finale? What if it was someone else's trap for him?" Outside, they could hear federal agents setting up a perimeter around the clinic. Time was running out, but Sarah's discovery had opened a new possibility, that they weren't just victims in Victor's revenge scheme, but potential allies in someone else's larger plan to bring him down. Thunder's eyes opened fully, and despite his pain, he struggled to sit up. His gaze moved between Marcus and Sarah, then toward the door where the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. For the first time in hours, Thunder's expression wasn't one of pain or fear, but determination. Whatever was coming through that door, whatever federal agents and bureaucrats were about to descend on their makeshift sanctuary, Thunder seemed ready to face it alongside the humans who had risked everything to save him. Marcus placed his hand on Thunder's massive head, feeling the warmth of the bond that had sustained them both for 15 years. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." The door burst open, and their fate walked in, wearing federal badges and carrying questions that would change everything. The remote cabin sat like a predator's trap in the wilderness, its rustic appearance masking the sophisticated surveillance equipment Victor Crowfeather had installed over months of careful preparation. Marcus and Sarah approached cautiously, their vehicles crunching over gravel that seemed too perfectly maintained for an abandoned hunting lodge. The coordinates Victor had provided led them 40 miles from civilization, deep into territory where screams wouldn't carry and bodies could disappear without investigation. Marcus felt Thunder's absence like a physical wound. The great bear was still recovering at Sarah's clinic, too weak for the journey, but too valuable as evidence for Victor to ignore. That vulnerability gnawed at Marcus as he checked his sidearm for the third time, knowing that whatever waited inside that cabin would determine whether Thunder lived or died. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered her veterinary bag and the evidence they'd collected about Victor's illegal operation. The python's tracking chip had led them here, along with financial records showing payments to exotic animal dealers and underground fighting promoters. But something felt wrong about Victor's sudden willingness to meet, his eager cooperation in providing this location. "This feels like a setup," Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the crisp mountain air. Marcus nodded grimly. "Everything about Victor has been a setup for 15 years. But if we don't go in there, Thunder dies in federal custody, and we spend the rest of our lives in prison." The cabin's door opened before they could knock, revealing Victor Crowfeather transformed from the disgraced ranger Marcus remembered. Gone was the bitter, broken man who'd been fired for corruption. In his place stood someone who radiated confidence and barely contained violence, wearing expensive tactical gear that spoke of serious financial backing. "Marcus," Victor said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "You're exactly on time, and Dr. Strongbear, thank you for bringing the evidence. It'll make this so much easier." They entered the cabin to find it wasn't abandoned at all, but a sophisticated command center filled with monitors, communication equipment, and cages that made Sarah's blood run cold. 3 massive Burmese pythons coiled in specialized enclosures, each one easily 20 feet long and trained for killing. Their reptilian eyes tracked every movement with predatory intelligence. "Welcome to the real wildlife management," Victor said, gesturing toward the monitors that showed feeds from locations across the western United States. "While you've been playing ranger and veterinarian, I've been building something that actually makes money from nature's resources." The screens revealed the scope of Victor's operation: underground fighting arenas where exotic animals battled to the death for wealthy spectators, breeding facilities that produced combat-trained predators, and training compounds where captured wildlife was conditioned for violence. It was a multi-million-dollar network that treated animals as weapons and entertainment. Marcus stared at footage of Thunder being forced to fight other animals, his noble spirit broken down through systematic abuse and psychological conditioning. The bear who'd once trusted humans completely had been turned into a gladiator for the amusement of twisted billionaires who bet fortunes on animal suffering. "You monster," Sarah breathed, recognizing the clinical precision of the abuse. "You've been torturing him for years." Victor's laugh was cold and satisfied. "I've been using him to generate the funds necessary for my real goal, destroying Marcus Whitehorse's life the same way he destroyed mine. Every dollar Thunder earned fighting bought me better lawyers, more sophisticated equipment, and deeper connections in the criminal world." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. While he'd been watching Thunder from a distance, believing his secret son was living free in the wilderness, Victor had been repeatedly capturing and traumatizing him. Thunder's occasional disappearances, which Marcus had attributed to natural migration patterns, had actually been periods of captivity and forced combat. "The python attack wasn't meant to kill Thunder," Victor continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining a complex theory. "It was meant to injure him severely enough that he'd need veterinary care, bringing both of you into federal custody where I could expose your illegal relationship while he died slowly from his wounds." Sarah realized the full scope of Victor's psychological warfare. "You wanted us to save him so we'd be emotionally destroyed when the legal system took him away." "Exactly." Victor's eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. 15 years of planning, and it's working perfectly. Marcus faces federal charges that will destroy his career and send him to prison. You've lost your veterinary license and your clinic. Thunder will be euthanized as a dangerous animal, and I'll be there to watch every moment of your collective destruction. The monitors around the cabin showed news coverage of their legal troubles, social media posts debating their guilt, and federal paperwork processing Thunder's death sentence. Victor had orchestrated a media campaign that painted them as reckless criminals who'd endangered public safety through their illegal wildlife activities. But Marcus noticed something in Victor's setup that didn't make sense. Too many cameras, too much documentation, as if everything was being recorded for posterity. You're not just destroying us for revenge, you're doing it for an audience. Victor's smile widened with genuine pride. My investors love a good story. The Rangers who thought they were above the law, brought down by their own illegal actions. It'll be a cautionary tale that keeps other law enforcement officers from interfering with our operations. Sarah studied the python enclosures with professional horror, recognizing the systematic conditioning that had turned natural predators into weapons. The snakes showed signs of chemical enhancement, surgical modification, and behavioral programming that went far beyond simple training. They were living weapons designed specifically for assassination. These aren't just fighting animals, she said, her veterinary training identifying the subtle modifications. You've been breeding them specifically to kill bears. To kill Thunder specifically, Victor corrected. DNA analysis, scent training, behavioral conditioning. I've spent 5 years creating the perfect Thunder-killing machine. And tonight, you're going to watch me finish what the first python started. The true scope of Victor's obsession became clear. This wasn't just about revenge or money. It was about demonstrating his complete dominance over the man who'd reported his corruption. He'd turned wildlife management into psychological warfare, using Thunder as both weapon and victim in an elaborate scheme of professional destruction. Marcus felt rage building in his chest. 15 years of suppressed anger at watching his secret son suffer while he remained powerless to help. Where is he, Victor? Where's Thunder now? Oh, didn't I mention? Victor's smile became genuinely cruel. Thunder isn't at Dr. Strongbear's clinic anymore. My associates collected him an hour ago. He's here, in the barn, waiting for his final performance. The sound that came from Marcus's throat was barely human. Sarah grabbed his arm to prevent him from lunging at Victor, knowing that violence would only accelerate whatever horrible plan was unfolding. But through the cabin's windows, they could hear the unmistakable sound of Thunder's distressed vocalizations, the deep, mournful calls of a bear in psychological torment. You see, Victor continued, clearly enjoying their horror, I've arranged a special farewell performance. Thunder versus all 3 of my pythons, live streamed to my most exclusive clients. Winner takes all, loser dies slowly. And you 2 get front row seats to watch the bear you illegally loved get torn apart by the weapons I created specifically for that purpose. Sarah's medical training kicked in despite her emotional devastation. Marcus, he's going to kill us too. We're witnesses to too much of his operation. Eventually, Victor agreed cheerfully. But first, you're going to help me prove that illegal wildlife rehabilitation creates dangerous animals. Thunder's going to attack you both, showing the world what happens when rangers and veterinarians think they know better than federal law. The monitors around the cabin showed incoming vehicles, black SUVs carrying what appeared to be Victor's criminal associates and wealthy clients who'd come to witness Thunder's final fight. The cabin was transforming from a trap into an amphitheater for their destruction. Marcus realized that Victor's revenge was more sophisticated than simple murder. He'd created a scenario where Thunder would be forced to hurt the humans he loved most, destroying the bear's spirit before killing his body. It was psychological torture designed to maximize suffering for all involved. You have 5 minutes to say goodbye, Victor announced, gesturing toward the barn where Thunder's cries were becoming more desperate. Then the show begins, and 15 years of planning finally pays off. As they were escorted toward the barn by armed men, Marcus caught Sarah's eye and saw the same desperate determination he felt. Whatever Victor had planned, whatever weapons he'd created, whatever audience he'd assembled, they weren't going down without a fight. Thunder's life depended on it, and after 15 years of loving him from a distance, Marcus was finally ready to risk everything to save his secret son. The barn doors opened, revealing the arena where their final battle would unfold. The federal courtroom felt like a tomb as Marcus Whitehorse sat beside his public defender, watching 15 years of his life's work crumble into legal jargon and criminal charges. The prosecution had painted him as a rogue ranger who'd violated federal wildlife protection laws, endangered public safety, and corrupted the very system he'd sworn to protect. Thunder, confined to a concrete enclosure at a federal facility, was Exhibit A in his destruction. Your Honor, the federal prosecutor continued, the defendant's illegal possession and release of a grizzly bear represents a fundamental breach of public trust. His actions have created a dangerous situation that culminated in the python attack, putting both wildlife and citizens at risk. Marcus stared at his hands, weathered from 35 years of protecting Yellowstone's wilderness. Emma sat in the gallery behind him, having one of her rare lucid days, her eyes filled with confusion and pain as she watched her husband being systematically destroyed by the legal system. Dr. Sarah Strongbear had been suspended from veterinary practice pending investigation. Her license was under review, her clinic permanently closed, and her reputation in tatters. The media had painted her as a co-conspirator in Marcus's wildlife trafficking operation, ignoring her decades of legitimate conservation work. The government seeks the maximum penalty, the prosecutor announced. 5 years in federal prison, forfeiture of pension and benefits, and permanent prohibition from wildlife-related employment. The gallery erupted in whispers. Local supporters who'd known Marcus for decades sat in stunned silence, while protesters outside demanded justice for wildlife crimes. Social media had turned his story into a lightning rod for debates about government overreach versus environmental protection. Marcus's public defender, overworked and overwhelmed, made a half-hearted plea for leniency that carried no conviction. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd built her career on strict interpretation of federal law, seemed unmoved by arguments about Marcus's good intentions or 35 years of exemplary service. But the cruelest blow came when Victor Crow Feather was called as the prosecution's star witness. Victor strode to the witness stand with the confidence of a man finally seeing his revenge fulfilled. Dressed in an expensive suit that spoke of mysterious newfound wealth, he carried himself like someone who'd never spent 15 years in disgrace after being fired from the National Park Service. Mr. Crowfeather, the prosecutor began, please tell the court about your observations of the defendant's illegal activities. Victor's testimony was devastating in its detail. He described years of surveillance, documented Marcus's regular visits to Thunder's territory, provided photographs of their interactions, and painted a picture of systematic wildlife law violations spanning over a decade. The defendant created a dangerous precedent, Victor testified, his voice carrying manufactured concern. When park rangers believe they can ignore federal law based on personal feelings, it undermines the entire conservation system. The irony was staggering. Victor, who'd been fired for corruption and bribery, was now presenting himself as a champion of legal wildlife protection, but his new role as whistleblower had apparently been lucrative. His expensive clothes and confident demeanor suggested someone who'd been well compensated for his cooperation with federal prosecutors. What Victor didn't mention, and what the prosecution carefully avoided, was his own illegal exotic animal operation. The python that had attacked Thunder had mysteriously disappeared from federal custody before it could be properly examined. Key evidence about the organized animal fighting ring had been lost in bureaucratic shuffles. Marcus's defense had tried to introduce evidence about Victor's criminal activities, but it had been ruled inadmissible due to insufficient documentation. Without the Python or Thunder's medical records showing evidence of systematic abuse, they couldn't prove the larger conspiracy. During cross-examination, Marcus's attorney made a feeble attempt to discredit Victor's testimony. "Isn't it true, Mr. Crowfeather, that you harbor personal animosity toward the defendant?" Victor's smile was cold and satisfied. "I harbor concern for the integrity of our federal wildlife protection system." "Personal feelings have no place in law enforcement," the attorney pressed harder. "You were terminated from the National Park Service for accepting bribes from poachers, weren't you?" "I was wrongfully terminated based on allegations made by the defendant," Victor replied smoothly. "Those charges were never proven in court." It was a masterful deflection. Victor had never been criminally prosecuted for his Park Service corruption. Marcus's administrative report had been enough to end his career, but not enough for criminal charges. Now, Victor was using that legal technicality to present himself as a victim of Marcus's overzealous enforcement. The prosecution rested its case with a devastating summation that portrayed Marcus as a dangerous rogue who'd put his personal feelings above public safety and federal law. The defense's response was weak and disorganized, failing to present a compelling narrative about love, conservation, or the complex realities of wildlife protection. Outside the courthouse, protesters had grown more vocal. "Lock him up," chanted one group, while a smaller group of Marcus's supporters held signs reading, "Hero, not criminal," and "Thunder's life mattered." The division reflected a broader national debate about wildlife protection, individual conscience versus institutional authority, and the role of civil disobedience in conservation. Emma, confused by the crowd and overwhelmed by the proceedings, had to be escorted to a quiet area by a victim's advocate. Her Alzheimer's made it impossible for her to fully understand why her husband was being destroyed, but her emotional distress was evident to everyone who saw her. Sarah, watching from the gallery, felt her own life unraveling in parallel with Marcus's destruction. Her daughter Rebecca had finally called, not to offer support, but to berate her mother for throwing away everything Dad built by getting involved with Marcus's criminal enterprise. "I'm embarrassed to tell people you're my mother," Rebecca had said during their brief, painful conversation. "All those years you chose animals over family, and now look where it got you." The words had cut deeper than any federal investigation. Sarah realized that in trying to save Thunder, she'd lost the last connection to her own daughter and destroyed any chance of rebuilding their relationship. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, Marcus faced the reality of his situation. At 62, 5 years in federal prison would effectively end his life. Emma's Alzheimer's would progress without him there to care for her. Their modest savings would be consumed by legal fees and medical bills. His legacy, 35 years of dedicated service to Yellowstone, would be reduced to a cautionary tale about rangers who thought they were above the law. But the deepest pain came from knowing that Thunder was suffering in federal custody. Confined to a concrete enclosure isolated from the wilderness that had been his home, Thunder was reportedly becoming increasingly distressed and aggressive. Federal wildlife officials spoke of rehabilitation and eventual placement in a zoo, but Marcus knew the truth. Thunder was dying emotionally in captivity, just as Marcus was dying in the face of legal persecution. The prosecution's closing argument was a clinical dissection of Marcus's violations of federal law, devoid of any acknowledgement of the love and dedication that had motivated his actions. The defense's closing was an emotional plea for understanding that fell flat in the face of overwhelming legal evidence. Judge Margaret Harrison announced that she would render her verdict the following morning. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus sat alone in the defendant's chair, staring at the American flag that stood beside the judge's bench. He thought about Thunder, alone in a concrete cell, probably wondering why the human who'd saved him as a cub had abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. He thought about Emma, whose moments of clarity were becoming rarer, and who would soon forget him entirely as her disease progressed. He thought about the wilderness he'd protected for 35 years, and how it would continue without him. Outside, Victor Crow Feather held an impromptu press conference, presenting himself as a reformed Park Service employee who'd found the courage to speak truth to power. His performance was polished and convincing, the culmination of 15 years of planning and preparation. Sometimes, Victor told the assembled reporters, true justice requires patience. Mr. Whitehorse thought he was above the law, but today proves that no one is beyond accountability. As night fell over the courthouse, Marcus Whitehorse faced the darkest hour of his life, knowing that tomorrow would likely bring a verdict that would destroy everything he'd worked for and everyone he loved. In a federal facility 40 miles away, Thunder lay on cold concrete, his massive form pressed against the bars of his enclosure, waiting for a reunion that might never come. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Judge Margaret Harrison entered at precisely 9 a.m., her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. Marcus sat beside his attorney, his weathered hands folded in his lap, preparing to hear words that would define the remainder of his life. Emma had been too confused that morning to attend, asking repeatedly why that nice ranger man wasn't coming to visit anymore. But before Judge Harrison could speak, the courtroom doors burst open with unexpected drama. A young woman in her late 20s strode down the center aisle, her long black hair flowing behind her like a banner of determination. Marcus didn't recognize her, but Sarah Strongbear's sharp intake of breath suggested she did. "Your Honor," the woman called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm Rebecca Strongbear, and I have evidence that will fundamentally change this case." Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like thunder. "Ms. Strongbear, this court is in session. You cannot simply—" "Your Honor, I'm a doctoral candidate in wildlife biology at Montana State University, and I've spent the last 6 months investigating the illegal exotic animal trade in the Rocky Mountain region." Rebecca's voice carried her mother's scientific precision, but with the passionate conviction of youth. "The evidence I've uncovered proves that the defendant and my mother are victims, not criminals." The prosecution objected vigorously, but Rebecca was already approaching the bench with a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor, these are federal investigation records that were deliberately withheld from the defense. Records that prove Victor Crow Feather has been operating an illegal animal fighting operation for over 10 years. Marcus felt his heart skip. This was Sarah's daughter, the one who hadn't spoken to her mother in months, who'd been ashamed of her mother's choices. But here she was, risking her own career to save them both. Judge Harrison examined the documents with growing interest. "Ms. Strongbear, how did you obtain federal investigation records?" "Through a Freedom of Information Act request that took 4 months to process," Rebecca replied. "These documents show that the FBI has been investigating Victor Crow Feather's animal trafficking network since 2019. The python that attacked Thunder wasn't an escaped pet. It was a trained fighting animal from Crow Feather's illegal operation." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Victor, sitting in the gallery, had gone pale beneath his expensive suit. The prosecution team huddled in urgent conference, clearly caught off guard by this development. Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Furthermore, these records show that Thunder, the bear at the center of this case, wasn't living wild for the past 15 years. He was repeatedly captured and forced to participate in illegal animal fighting contests. The trauma evident in his behavior isn't from improper wildlife management. It's from systematic abuse by Victor Crow Feather's criminal organization. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter, the child she'd thought was lost to her forever, fighting to save everything that mattered. Rebecca had inherited her mother's scientific mind and her father's sense of justice, combining them into a force that was dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece. "Your Honor," Rebecca said, producing a laptop computer, "I also have video evidence obtained through undercover investigation. This footage shows Victor Crow Feather's facility, the systematic abuse of thunder and other wildlife, and conversations where Mr. Crow Feather explicitly discusses using this trial to destroy Marcus Whitehorse's life while protecting his own criminal enterprise." Judge Harrison called for a recess while she reviewed the evidence. During the break, Rebecca approached her mother for the first time in months, their reunion awkward but profound in the crowded hallway outside the courtroom. "Mom," Rebecca said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I didn't understand what you were fighting for until I started researching wildlife trafficking for my dissertation. When I saw your name in the news, I realized you weren't just saving animals. You were standing up against organized crime." Sarah embraced her daughter, years of pain and separation dissolving in a moment of understanding. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "You taught me to fight for what's right," Rebecca replied. "I just needed time to figure out what that meant." When court reconvened, the dynamic had shifted completely. The prosecution, faced with overwhelming evidence of their star witness's criminal activities, requested a sidebar conference with the judge. Victor Crow Feather was conspicuously absent from the gallery. Word had spread that FBI agents had arrested him in the courthouse parking lot. Judge Harrison's voice carried new gravity when she addressed the court. "In light of new evidence presented by Ms. Rebecca Strongbear, this court must reconsider the charges against the defendant. The evidence suggests that Mr. Whitehorse's actions, while technically violations of federal regulations, were part of a larger pattern of wildlife protection that inadvertently exposed serious criminal activity." Marcus felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "this court cannot simply ignore federal wildlife protection laws, even when the defendant's motivations were admirable. Mr. Whitehorse did illegally possess and care for a protected grizzly bear without proper permits or oversight." The courtroom held its breath as Judge Harrison weighed justice against law, compassion against regulation. "Therefore, this court sentences Marcus Whitehorse to 5 years probation, community service working with legal wildlife rehabilitation programs, and a fine equal to the cost of Thunder's medical care and proper relocation." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "Additionally, Mr. Whitehorse will serve as a federal consultant on wildlife trafficking cases, using his expertise to help identify and prevent illegal animal operations." The gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Marcus sat in stunned silence, hardly believing that his nightmare was ending not in destruction, but in vindication. But Judge Harrison had one more surprise. Furthermore, based on the evidence of systematic abuse and the unique circumstances of this case, Thunder will be relocated to the newly established Whitehorse Wildlife Sanctuary, a facility that will be jointly operated by Mr. Whitehorse and Dr. Sarah Strongbear under federal oversight. Sarah gasped audibly. Not only had they avoided prison, but they were being given the opportunity to continue their life's work together and with federal support rather than federal persecution. As the court session ended, federal agents provided more details about Victor's arrest. His illegal animal operation had generated millions of dollars in gambling revenue, with wealthy clients paying enormous sums to watch exotic animals fight. Thunder had been his prize attraction, a grizzly bear who'd been conditioned to trust humans, making him uniquely vulnerable to exploitation. The python attack had been Victor's attempt to eliminate evidence while simultaneously destroying Marcus and Sarah. But Rebecca's investigation had unraveled 15 years of careful criminal planning, exposing a network that extended far beyond Wyoming into organized crime syndicates across the western United States. Outside the courthouse, Marcus was surrounded by supporters who'd maintained faith in his character despite the legal persecution. Native American tribal leaders spoke of traditional values of protecting wildlife. Veteran rangers testified to Marcus's decades of exemplary service. Environmental groups that had initially condemned him now offered apologies and support. But the most meaningful moment came when Emma, brought to the courthouse by a neighbor, had a moment of perfect clarity. She looked at Marcus with recognition and love, saying simply, "I knew my husband was innocent. He's always protected things that couldn't protect themselves." Sarah stood beside them, her arm around Rebecca, watching a family reunion that mirrored her own. 3 generations of women, grandmother, mother, and daughter, finding their way back to each other through love, forgiveness, and shared commitment to protecting the voiceless. As the sun set over the courthouse steps, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Thunder was safe, his reputation was restored, and the woman who'd risked everything to save them both was standing beside him, ready to build something new from the ashes of their ordeal. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Emma's Alzheimer's would continue to progress. The new wildlife sanctuary would require enormous effort to establish and maintain. Thunder would need months of rehabilitation to recover from his trauma. But for the first time since that terrible morning when he'd found Thunder wrapped in python coils, Marcus believed that justice, love, and dedication could triumph over revenge, corruption, and cruelty. In a federal facility 40 miles away, Thunder lifted his massive head as if sensing that change was coming. Soon he would be going home, to a place where he could heal, where he could trust again, and where the bond between species could flourish under the protection of law rather than in defiance of it. 6 months later, the morning sun painted golden streaks across the Whitehorse Wildlife Sanctuary as Marcus walked the familiar trails with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. The federal funding had transformed Sarah's old clinic into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility, complete with natural habitat enclosures and cutting-edge veterinary equipment. But more importantly, it had given them something precious: legitimacy. Thunder emerged from the tree line ahead, his massive form moving with the easy grace of a bear who'd finally found peace. The scars from his ordeal with Victor's pythons had healed, but more significantly, the psychological wounds were mending too. Under Sarah's expert care and Marcus's patient companionship, Thunder had slowly learned to trust again. "Morning, old friend," Marcus said softly, and Thunder responded with the same gentle chuff that had marked their bond for 16 years. But now their relationship existed in the light, sanctioned by federal oversight and celebrated by a community that had come to understand the difference between law and justice. Sarah approached from the medical facility, Rebecca at her side carrying research equipment. The mother-daughter relationship had blossomed into a professional partnership, with Rebecca's doctoral research on human-animal bonding providing scientific foundation for their sanctuary's groundbreaking rehabilitation methods. "Thunder's cortisol levels are completely normal now," Rebecca announced, reviewing the latest test results. "No signs of chronic stress or trauma response. Whatever healing happened here, it's measurable." Emma sat on a bench nearby, wrapped in a warm blanket despite the mild weather. Her Alzheimer's had progressed, but she still had moments of clarity, especially around Thunder. The massive bear seemed to sense her condition, approaching her with extraordinary gentleness during her confused episodes. "Is that my bear?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the wonderment of someone meeting thunder for the first time every day. "Yes, honey," Marcus said, settling beside his wife. "That's Thunder. He's part of our family." Thunder padded over and carefully positioned himself near Emma's feet, close enough to provide comfort but never overwhelming in his presence. It was as if he understood that this fragile human needed protection just as he once had. Dr. James Stonecrow, the federal wildlife supervisor assigned to oversee their sanctuary, approached with his morning inspection clipboard. Initially skeptical of the unusual arrangement, he'd become one of their strongest advocates after witnessing the remarkable results of their work. "I've got news from Washington," he said, his usually serious demeanor softened by excitement. "Congress is considering the Thunder Act, federal legislation that would create legal pathways for emergency wildlife rehabilitation like what Marcus did 16 years ago." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Thunder's story had become a catalyst for changing how federal law approached wildlife conservation, creating space for compassion within legal frameworks that had previously been rigid and unforgiving. "There's more," Dr. Stonecrow continued. "National Geographic wants to fund a full documentary about the sanctuary. They're calling it Bonds Beyond Species, The Thunder Story." Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying pure joy. "Thunder's going to be famous, though I think he'd prefer more salmon in his diet to celebrity status." As if responding to his name, Thunder lifted his massive head and looked at each human in turn, his dark eyes reflecting the intelligence and emotional depth that had made this entire journey possible. He was no longer the traumatized bear who'd been forced to fight for human entertainment, nor the wild animal living in secret shame. He was simply Thunder, loved, protected, and free to be himself. The sanctuary had welcomed 17 other rescued animals in its first 6 months, each one benefiting from the revolutionary approach that combined scientific expertise with emotional understanding. Marcus's federal consulting work had helped shut down 3 more illegal animal operations, while Sarah's research was being studied by veterinarians worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Emma, despite her advancing illness, had found new purpose in the gentle routines of sanctuary life. Rebecca had reconciled not just with her mother, but with her own calling to continue the family legacy of wildlife protection. And Marcus had learned that sometimes breaking unjust laws was the first step toward creating just ones. As the afternoon light began to fade, the small group sat together watching Thunder explore his domain, 20 acres of protected wilderness where he could be wild and safe simultaneously. He paused at the edge of the meadow, looking back at the humans who'd risked everything to save him, then disappeared into the forest with the quiet dignity of a creature who knew he was home. "You know," Emma said during one of her clear moments, "some families are born and some families are chosen, but the best families are the ones that choose to save each other." Marcus took her hand, watching Thunder's sanctuary settle into evening peace, and knew that love, in all its forms, had won. Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't between people. They're between souls who recognize each other across the vast divide of species, age, and circumstance. Marcus Whitehorse discovered this truth when he chose love over law, risking everything to save an orphaned bear cub named Thunder. For 16 years, their bond remained a beautiful secret until the world tried to tear them apart through legal persecution and organized cruelty. But here's what gives me chills every time I think about this story. It wasn't just about one man and one bear. It was about Dr. Sarah Strongbear finding purpose after her husband's death, about Rebecca healing her relationship with her mother, about Emma finding moments of clarity through Thunder's gentle presence. It was about a community learning that sometimes the greatest acts of civil disobedience come from the deepest wells of compassion. Marcus could have followed every regulation and let that 6-week-old cub die alone in the wilderness. Instead, he chose illegal love, and that choice created ripples of healing that touched 3 generations of families. In our golden years, when legacy matters more than rules, what would you risk everything to save? Have you ever had to choose between what's legal and what's right? What bonds in your life have transcended conventional boundaries? Share your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful connections come from the most unexpected places.